Well, hey everybody, good to see you again. Dr. Andy Galpin, 55-Minute Phys. This is another video in my giant series on all things fatigue, conditioning, endurance, whatever the hell you want to call it, I don't care. Now, to give you a little help here, we've answered a bunch of questions in this context already. You can see other videos, both 55 and 5, and maybe even a 25-minute version, I don't remember exactly, where we answered things like endurance, how I split it up, how I program for it, so how I write different workouts for different types of endurance. That video is important for you to watch, or all those videos, before you watch this one. Because what we're going to get to eventually is how and why I program is based on the physiology I'm about to explain to you. Well, and more specifically, what we're going to get to in the next video in this series is what you can do about it nutritionally and training-wise. Once you understand why things break down with different types of endurance, then you can fix them accordingly, right? So what I'm really suggesting is, if you haven't seen those videos where I answer questions 1 and 2, what is endurance, how do I program for it, go back right now. I promise you, come back to this video after you've watched that. If also you're trying to skip ahead and go to the next version, the next video in this series, which is a 55-minute physiology and endurance video, where I answer questions like, why we get tired in the first place, what our VO2 max is. This is a term we hear all the time with endurance, but you maybe not know exactly what it is. Why we breathe, and why is this breath work becoming so popular right now? Is it true? Not? Well, I wouldn't watch that video either without watching this one. So my order of operations: number 1, the programming, what is endurance videos. Number 2, this one. And number 3, 55-minute physiology of endurance. So in this particular video, what I want to do is drill down deep on how we actually make energy for human movement. If you're thinking to yourself, oh, I don't need to watch this, I had Phys class, I know oxidation, glycolytic, blah, blah, blah. That's not the whole picture here. You're going to really do yourself a disservice by skipping this video and going to the third one. We will cover that a little bit, but I promise you, we'll do it in a fashion that's a little more entertaining, that's a little more correct, and we're going to fill in some gaps. So if you've had Phys before, like you're one of my students watching right now, you've had Phys, I know you have, maybe a couple of times. We're going to take some of those concepts, build on them, and it'll be a really nice refresher, but we'll do a better job of putting it in context of human performance and why it actually matters. If you've never had Phys, don't fret. I think you can get through this video just fine, 95% or so retention rate here without ever having Phys the way we laid it out. All right, so I think there's something in here for a little bit for everyone. We'll be excited, and we'll jump right into it. Looking forward to it. Thanks for sticking around, and let's get going. All right, before we get started, let's make sure really quickly we're on the same page in terms of definitions. So I'll use endurance, fatigue, conditioning fairly synonymously in these series of videos. Now, they're not the exact same thing, but they're close enough for now. And I just mean your ability to endure something difficult and keep going. In previous videos, you're going to have to go back and watch. I think I had a 25-minute version and maybe even a 5-minute version of this. But I split up endurance into a bunch of different levels. Now, I'm not going to cover them here. I'm just going to give you the condensed version. I'll call muscular endurance, like your ability of the local muscle itself to manage fatigue. Think, how many push-ups can you do in a minute, right? Think reps to fail. Think the burn in an actual local muscle. Kind of going from there, I'll just combine everything together and call it high intensity. Think intervals, think sprints on the track, uphill where you're getting really tired, anaerobic conditioning, throwing up, etc. Something in the 30 seconds to 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes of really hard-ass work. I'll call that all high intensity. And then past that further, I'll just call it long-duration endurance. So this is your more classic cardio, your sustained effort. I prefer the term long-duration endurance. This is consecutive or continuous work, maybe some small undulations in intensity, but for really long time domains. Now this is going to be important because as I'm going through this discussion, and particularly at the end, after I've explained to you what happens physiologically that causes fatigue, I'm going to differentiate between these different things so we understand, well, what causes fatigue for muscular endurance? What can I do about it? What causes fatigue for high intensity stuff? And what can I do about it? And then the same for long duration. I'll cover a little bit nutritionally. That's maybe in some other videos. If you're nice and you ask pretty please below, ask me and maybe I'll do that. But really more about programming. And really the focus of this big, large video, it's going to be a long one anyways. I don't need to add more to it. So really I just want to focus on the physiology of what's happening. And maybe we'll come back later and make some more videos giving you the practical tips, right? You'll get some, but not a tremendous amount. While we're here, by the way, I want to give a quick shout out to my friends on the screen here. You can see Chris Moore in that deadlift pull, good friend of mine. Coach McG, Mike McGoldrick, CTP, and Alex Macklin from Barbell Shrugged crew and fame doing their intervals there. And then, of course, the sensational Ms. Boone there in her Spartan race. So nonetheless, let's go ahead and move on. And the first thing we have to do is talk about why we get tired. From this perspective, I'm only going to talk about physiology. We're not going to get into the brain or psychology or motivation or anything like that. Just physiologically and mostly bioenergetically why we get tired. Well, it's really an effect of two different things, or it's a combination. We failed to be able to produce sufficient ATP, or energy. Now, a quick reminder, ATP is the energy currency of all biological cells. It's the little molecule we have to make to produce energy. So what happens is we, for some reason, and there's a whole host, what we're going to get into, of reasons, we don't create sufficient ATP or energy to meet the demands of the exercise. Right? Moving muscle takes energy, we've got to meet that demand. This also could be happening, or it could not be happening. We don't necessarily know, kind of depends on the situation. But you could just be simply generating too much waste. The good example here is typically with aerobic or steady state exercise, it's not really a huge issue of creating too much waste. It's a problem of being able to create enough energy. Now, anaerobic or burn stuff, fatigue stuff, like real high, again, make you throw up, that's typically not an issue of not being able to create enough energy. It's mostly not being able to handle the waste. So let's get into these in a lot more detail, and we're going to spend the bulk of our time dealing, or at least initially here, dealing with number one, which is not having enough pure ATP. Now, if you've had an exercise physiology class, this is going to feel like a little bit of a review there, but I'll put it in context of performance, and I think I can do it a little bit better than most of your teachers. So the basics, a lot of you have heard. Now, I also have I know at least a 5-minute Phys video on this. You should go back and watch that one, so I'll give you the quick version here, but you'll see a guest appearance from my favorite dog, Ghostface Killer, running around, and the analogy I like to give with wood and fire, I'll bring up there. But for now, here's the quick overview. There are basically 4 what we'll call substrates, or things you can use to create energy in a human cell, particularly skeletal muscle. Starting off, number 1 we'll talk is carbohydrate, and you can see the image I'm using there is the picture of the hamburger bun, fat, and protein. Now, when I say carbohydrate, I don't just mean bread or grains. Okay, in fact, go watch one of my nutrition videos where I talk about what carbohydrates actually are and distinguishing them between fats and how those things actually work. I've covered that extensively in hours of videos now on other products. So for now, carbohydrates, fat. I know there's protein in cheese, but this is say it's fat. I know there's fat in a hamburger, but I just was thinking about hamburgers when I made this, so I kind of broke them all down. Right, well, there's another one that's called phosphocreatine. Now, it is different than fats, carbs, and protein in the fact that it's not a macronutrient. It's not a food you consume, but it is a direct path, definitely the most direct path to ATP. So I like to put it up here as kind of a 4th one, right? Even though it's not technically another macronutrient. So here's what really happens. Regardless of what we're using for the fuel, the whole damn point is to get to ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate, which is why you can see those 3 P's standing on top of those little flags, if you will, of that ATP molecule. So triphosphate. Now, effectively, the analogy I like to use is think of protein not as a source of cellular energy. Now, as I just showed you, you can use it to make ATP. We'll get into this later, but that's not the primary reason we need and ingest protein. So what I would say is if you're trying to create something of importance in the cell, so say you're trying to add more muscle mass, or you want to recover the muscle mass that you damaged in a given workout, or build a new immune cell, or 1,000 other things that you can use for protein. Right? We use protein for a lot of different things. And you had a bunch of hunk metal, scrap metal kind of laying around somewhere. And you can see in the image here, you got a big piece of metal there, and it's not particularly useful for anything. You want to repurpose all that metal. So you've got the supply. You've got all of this scrap metal somewhere. Now, in the case of protein, we'll refer to that as amino acids. So amino acids come together to make up a protein. So if you've got a whole pool of amino acids somewhere, but they're not in the organization, they're not making up the particular protein you like, well, then you have to do something with it. In other words, it is tremendously effective supply. So one of the major reasons we ingest or consume protein is so that we have sufficient amounts of amino acids available so that we can combine them in the orders we want to make the particular proteins we want. Covered extensively in other videos, but we make about 100,000 different types of proteins in the body. So you've got your amino acids. Well, in order to make those into a protein, that takes a lot of energy, right? It's a really metabolically costly process. So in order to do that, where are you going to get that energy from? Enter this analogy. So go back and watch the other video, but the quick version. All right. If, in my opinion, you could think of phosphocreatine as like a match. Imagine you're making a fire and you're making a campfire, if you will. Well, if you take a match, which is made of wood and some stuff in the end, the benefit of using a match to make a fire is it lights extremely quickly, but the downside is it burns out really fast. I mean, if you lit a match and held it there until it burned all the way to the bottom, I mean, I don't know what it would be, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30, I don't know, 5, who knows, some less than a minute or so, matter of seconds. Well, a carbohydrate, which is also made of wood, by the way, in this particular case, this is carbon what I'm talking about. Well, think of it like a newspaper. A newspaper is a good way to start a fire, but if your entire fire is based on newspaper, the downside is, I mean, if you put a whole newspaper into a fire, how long until it burns out? I don't know, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes? Something like that, right? It's a little bit longer than creatine, probably by an order of magnitude, but it's still pretty dang short. It'd be a pain in the ass to make an entire campfire with just newspaper. Fat, on the other hand, functions more like wood. And so again, the nice part here is what you'll notice is wood, newspaper is made from wood, right? And the match, made from wood, are all based on the same structural components, which are carbon. We'll come back to this later, but that's really, really, really important. They're big, long carbon chains. Phosphocreatine is a short one, right? The carbohydrates are a little bit longer, 6 or so. Well, fats are basically infinitely long. So the benefit of using wood for a fire, in this case, is it's not as easy to light. It takes some time to get going. It's kind of a pain in the ass. There's literally a time delay, right? You won't have a fire going, I promise you. You take a match, your fire is going immediately, right? You somehow light up a piece of newspaper, that fire is going to happen immediately. You can't light many forms of wood on fire immediately. It takes a couple of minutes of smoldering and getting them going, right? But the benefit is they last exponentially longer, basically infinitely longer than the carbohydrates and the protein. And so that's really the benefit of what we're going for. We have to understand then, it's not that one of these fuels is better than another. In fact, we'll talk about the pros and cons of all of them and how they relate to fatigue. It's just the fact that they have pros and cons, right? And so a healthy, high-functioning athlete, in most particular cases, or general human, should have an appropriate ability to use which fuel source is best given the demands of the situation. And that changes based on when you change the demand or the situation, what you're asking the body to do. So we need to recognize that, and then we can take our training and our nutrition and apply that appropriately based on what we're trying to get out of our athlete. What's our purpose? What's our goal? What are we training for? Nonetheless, if you do this properly, and you use the phosphocreatine, carbohydrate, and fat to generate the most optimal amount of ATP, you can use that energy to go back and do things, a whole number of things, but one of them would be combining amino acids into a sequence to make a protein that you particularly want. And this is our relationship with what we call protein synthesis and energy metabolism, right? It's one of the major things we do with this. So in the analogy I gave a second ago, if we've got this whole hunk of metal and all this scrap around in this kind of a junky piece of thing, and we use and we invest some energy and we make a nice big smoldering fire at the proper temperature that's not wasteful, but when we need to melt it, we can recombine that metal and make it into something more useful, like a giant awesome sword, right? If you didn't laugh at that, you're breaking my heart. I know it's a super lame joke that probably didn't translate very well onto YouTube, but it sometimes makes like 3 of my students laugh in class, and I like it because it's an awesome sword. So to hell with you. One of the major points I'm really getting at here is if we take this concept of aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, we need to talk about how these things interact. Spoiler alert, I don't know why we think they're against each other. Like one's better than the other and it's fighting. Do you want to be? This is not how the system works. So a little bit of backup of what actually happens with aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic means oxygen or needing oxygen. Anaerobic means you don't have to have oxygen available to produce energy. So when we talk about those macronutrients and phosphocreatine, where on the spectrum do these lie? In other words, when I use phosphocreatine to make energy, is that an aerobic process? Or is it an anaerobic process? What about fat? What about carbs? What about protein? Well, if you've had a little bit of Phys, or you're one of my students in class right now, I know you know most of these things, but you probably don't know all of it. And maybe you're a little bit jumped up. It's been a couple of years since Phys, so you're kind of like, I don't remember exactly. So let's lay this out really quickly so we're on the same page. Now, first of all, that little image I just flashed up on the screen is called a mitochondria. Anytime you hear the word aerobic, you can automatically assume it's happening in the mitochondria. And this plays a critical role to fatigue. I'm not just teaching you Phys to teach you Phys. I promise you, this explains why some things cause, exercise-wise, cause more or less fatigue, and what the hell to do about it, training-wise and nutrition-wise. So, when you hear oxidation, when you hear aerobic, you know this is happening in the mitochondria. If it's not happening in the mitochondria, it means it's happening outside of it in the cell cytoplasm. Right? So you pick a muscle cell. It's got all these mitochondria inside of it. And then there's this other place that's outside of the mitochondria but still inside the cell. Anaerobic metabolism happens in that other space. Aerobic happens in this mitochondria. All right? So now, if we start from the easy end of the spectrum, I know you know this and you realize this. If I flashed up phosphocreatine, where would this go on the spectrum of anaerobic to aerobic? Is phosphocreatine metabolism an aerobic process? In other words, you have to have oxygen to do it? Or do you not? Well, the answer is no, right? It is an entirely 100% anaerobic process. In fact, the stoichiometry is favorable for phosphocreatine in that, in fact, that it takes one phosphocreatine to make one ATP. It's a very direct one-step process. Not a lot going on here. Tremendous benefit. Downside? We'll get to that in a minute. What about fat? Where's fat on the spectrum? Well, fat is actually 100% aerobic. Ooh, interesting. So now what we can see happen in the muscle cell is when I want to make energy extremely quickly, just between these two, which one would I choose? Well, obviously phosphocreatine, right? Number one, because it's not in the mitochondria, it's actually outside of that. And so I don't have to go through these extra steps, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But I can just have a one-step process, boom, make ATP. Fat, on the other hand, has to be broken down wherever I'm taking it from, either outside of the muscle cell or outside of the muscle entirely, brought up, taken into mitochondria, and then I have to use aerobic halfway steps to get the energy from fat. What this means is there's going to be a delay there. And there's also a problem is, what if I need that energy and I don't have oxygen, like I'm doing high-intensity intervals? Oh, then I'm going to go back to creatine. But the downside of creatine is it's that match. You don't have much of it. You can only store so much of it in the actual muscle cell. Now, I don't store my fat in my mitochondria. I store my fat in other places throughout the body. So the storage ability of fat is exponentially higher than phosphocreatine. So again, folks, it's not a good or bad thing. There's pros and cons, right? The benefit of having to use it in mitochondria and not storing a tremendous amount in muscle is I can store it unlimited amounts throughout the rest of the body in my adipose tissue. Well, I don't store phosphocreatine in other places, I mean, for the most part. So I can only store the amount that I can hold inside the muscle cell that's not inside the mitochondria. But the benefit is it's really quick. It's right there. You probably knew most of that already, hopefully. What about protein? It turns out protein is an entirely aerobic process as well. And so we're going to have to run that through there. This is another one of the many reasons why it's not a tremendously good source for ATP in terms of energy. It's also the stoichiometry, meaning how much energy it kind of takes, the chemistry of it, the equation. How much energy it takes to break down our protein to get ATP versus how much ATP we actually get of that. It's not tremendously favorable. So it's not a good way, it's not a good method to go about making ATP. It's really inefficient, if you will. Carbohydrates are the final piece of this puzzle in the fact that, wait a minute, is it aerobic or anaerobic? No passive listening here. I want you to think, is it aerobic or anaerobic? Well, it's kind of a trick because it's a little bit of both. So there's an anaerobic component to it and an aerobic component to it. So if you see this spectrum now, what we can clearly identify is our cells have figured out escape mechanism. In other words, I'm going to have something that's entirely anaerobic, I'm going to have something that is entirely aerobic, and then I'll have something that is in between. And this gives you tremendous flexibility and a ton of resilience, right? And this is the whole damn point, right? One of the things that separates humans from any other species especially, is our ability to adapt and survive in any situation. Well, this is why your system works the way it does. I want to have the ability to have something strong over here. It's really effective in this method. It's really effective over here, but sucks in another one. And then I'll put something in between. And so I always make sure I can handle at least minimal amounts of energy production. So with the carbohydrates, it starts off anaerobically without oxygen. But in order to completely metabolize carbohydrate, I need to be able to go into oxygen. And this is one of the many reasons we often say things like even an anaerobic athlete needs to at least have some aerobic component, because that's what's going to allow me to recover, or that's going to allow me to be able to do more anaerobic endurance, especially think of things like repeated sprint ability, or a sport like MMA that I work with that is kind of anaerobic, but you have to do it so many times in a row that it eventually ends up being like high intensity intervals, but a bunch of them, tons of them in a row. So it really has a huge aerobic component to it as well. And this is one of the major reasons, right? Because during that 10-second wrestling exchange or striking exchange, yeah, you're probably using mostly carbohydrate for energy. But you need to be able to go aerobic after that to finish that metabolic breakdown of carbohydrate, because you got to be able to do it again. If you don't do that, if you half metabolize carbohydrate anaerobically and don't fully metabolize it through your aerobic systems, you get left with a tremendous amount of waste. We'll get into what that waste product actually is, but do you know what it is? I'll give you a hint. I got another couple of videos already up. Maybe if you already watched them, you're probably thinking, I know the answer. That's what he covered in that. It's one of the first videos I did. So that's our spectrum. That's what we want to keep in mind. That's our foundation for how we generate energy globally for exercise and performance. So, little quiz for you. Test. If I say you're in my class and I said, okay, right now today, I'm going to lay these 3 food items on a table. And when we come back, we meet either 2 days from now or a week from now, depending on the class schedule. You're going to have to take a bite of one of these 3 items. And I'm going to leave it right there on the table in class. There's some rice, an open avocado, and a big chunk of meat. Which one would you take a bite of? Well, anyone who's reasonable would say, I'm going to definitely take a bite of that rice. It's not going to taste great. It's going to be dehydrated. You leave it out for a week, it'll lose some moisture. It'll get real stale. But it won't rot. It won't go rancid. By the way, those terms, rancid and rot, those are kind of, that's the same thing as saying aerobically metabolized, or metabolized for that matter. So when I use my fat on my side for fuel, for exercise, that's going rancid. I'm not exactly here, but you get the point, right? I'm making my love handle go rancid. I'm metabolizing it and using it for energy. We just don't like it when it's in our food, but we love it when it's in our fat, right, that we're trying to get rid of. So the point being, why is it when you open an avocado or meat, it goes rancid? Well, because the fat and the protein that's in the meat, remember, it's aerobic. So if you expose fat or protein rather, to oxygen, it starts metabolizing. It starts going down. In fact, any of you have ever had a good steak? I was just at a steakhouse last 2 nights ago, and I had a 120-day aged 8-ounce ribeye, and it was like 89 or $90 or something like that. Well, what that means, if you don't know, is they take that ribeye and leave it out hanging for 120 days. Yeah, they let it rot basically. And then they come, actually, it gets this green film, kind of brown film on the outside. They come out, shave that film off, and then you have this amazing piece of meat. And why is it amazing? And why is it super expensive? Why is aged meat more? Well, because when you metabolize it like that, you let it go rancid, it gets a lot more tender. It loses its toughness because you've half metabolized it, right? You've made it into mush, really, really tender. If you eat a steak from something just killed an hour ago, it won't be as tender as something that you age for 30 days or 49 days or 120 days or whatever. Right? And that's because you're letting it go rancid. You're letting it be metabolized. Right? That whole like cutting off of the green stuff, that's totally true. Right? So if you've had a good piece of tender steak or meat, it's been let have some funk grow on it for a while, and they just shaved it off, made it nice and pretty. Avocado too. Everyone, of course, this is blown up in the last decade, right? Everyone knows avocados are primarily fat. So when I open that damn thing up and I expose it, starts metabolizing. So any of you cooks out there, and at least pseudo cooks, anyone that loves guacamole like I do, knows when you open up the flesh of an avocado, the first thing you do, if you're not going to just eat it immediately, is you cover it with a little bit of citric acid, right? Lime juice, lemon juice, something like that, maybe even some salt. And the reason you do that is because the acid, the citric acid, right, from the citric fruit, well, acids stop metabolism. We'll go over this later. But if you put yourself in an extremely high acidic environment, enzymes don't work. A little bit of enzyme, a little bit of acid really helps them. A lot of it, they don't work. And so you can stop the metabolic process of the fat or the meat, for that matter. What have we been doing for hundreds of years before we had refrigerators? You take a piece of meat and you salt the living crap out of it, and it preserves. Right? You block the enzymes from working, so it doesn't metabolize. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why leaving the core end of the avocado helps as well, because it's secreting those same things to keep the flesh from rotting inside. Right? Take that thing out, it goes brown faster. Okay, so why doesn't that happen with the carbohydrate? Well, remember, fat, protein are aerobic, right? But carbohydrate metabolism, in order to get to aerobic, has to start anaerobically. So we need an anaerobic kickstarter. If you leave carbohydrates out and you give them an anaerobic kickstarter, boom, it'll take off. If not, they will be much more shelf stable. And this is one of the many, many, many reasons why all of our snack foods, the vast majority of our foods that are produced, are heavy in the carbohydrate because they're just much more shelf stable. It's not that this government conspiracy to get you fat or give you Alzheimer's or whatever the hell that they say carbohydrates do. It's just the fact that they're simply much more shelf stable. This means they can produce products and ship them across the country. You can have the carbohydrate you like on every corner and every vending machine. It's pretty tough to get pure protein that's not dehydrated, right? So if you want protein in a snack in a vending machine, it's going to have to be a jerky or something that's been processed and treated like that. You're also not going to get too many avocados in vending machines, right? It's just too tough. So why does all this stuff matter? Here's one. Classic exercise physiology here. What I'm showing you is the maximal rate of ATP generation. In other words, of these different fuel components, how quickly does each generate ATP? Think back to the match. Think back to the wood and the log. The match, phosphocreatine, really fast. Boy, tremendously effective at making energy quick. Glycolysis, which is like lysis, right? Splitting up of glycogen, glucose, carbohydrate. Right? We'll come back to that. That's not as fast, but still really, really, really fast. From there, we have to go into oxidation. So now we start having to use oxygen to create energy. And remember, we oxidize fat as a fuel, but we also oxidize carbohydrate. So if you look at that chart right now, you're thinking, what the hell is the difference between glycolysis and carbohydrate? They're both using carbohydrate, but that glycolysis is the anaerobic portion of it. And then when I finish the anaerobic portion of it, I move to the aerobic or oxidative portion of it. They just abbreviated that as carbohydrate. But both of them are carbohydrate, right? And so even aerobic oxidation of carbohydrate is still a lot faster, probably twice or more faster than an oxidation of fat. And there's a reason why. We'll come back to that later. But I'm not saying fat's bad or carbohydrate oxidation is bad, because although they are slow, the inverse is their storage capacity is basically unlimited. I mean, look at the storage you have of matches. You can't carry that much PCR around because you pack it in the cytoplasm of the muscle cells. You can't carry that much. Well, the same thing with your ability to go through anaerobic glycolysis of carbohydrate. In fact, the total amount of carbohydrate you can store in your body is very, very low. You primarily store it in muscle. That's the biggest component. A little bit in blood and a lot in your liver. 3 big places that you store carbohydrate in your body, right? But fat is unlimited, right? If you need to store more fat, you'll just keep packing more in. You'll make more adipocytes, more adipose tissue, your fat cells, right? You'll pack more lipids and fat into those adipose cells. It's unlimited. You can't do that with carbohydrate because in order to continue to do that, we either have to make the liver bigger or we have to make the muscles bigger. And you're not going to do that. You're just going to take that extra stuff and convert it away into fat and store it as fat. All right? And so now hopefully we're understanding the pros and cons of both situations and systems. What's the problem, right? Well, why is it so slow? Like, why is the oxidation of carbohydrate so slow? That's our real issue. Well, we have to go back and we look at a chart like this. So what this is showing you is how these different physiological systems interact, assuming you're doing some all-out exercise. Again, ATP PCR, that's going to be your match. It's going to give you 10, 15, 20 seconds of energy. The anaerobic glycolysis portion somewhere in that 20-second domain to a couple of minutes. And the oxidative system takes over. So why is that oxidative carbohydrate system so slow, especially compared to glycolysis? It's because we now have to breathe in oxygen, transport that oxygen through our blood, get that from the blood into the capillaries, get that from the capillaries into the muscle cell, get that muscle cell then into the mitochondria, and get that all shipped into the mitochondria itself. When I use carbohydrate for metabolism anaerobically, all I do is take the carbohydrate that's stored in my muscle, one-step process, boom, kind of one-step process. Now I'm making ATP. So I'll say that one more time. Even when I'm using carbohydrate anaerobically, I'm using it directly in the exercising cell. It's not in the mitochondria, it's in the cytoplasm. It's basically a one-step, and it's actually like 5, but one step basically inside there to make ATP. If I want to use that same carbohydrate molecule, but I want to use it aerobically, I have to bring in oxygen, transport that oxygen through the arteries, transport that into the capillaries, get it from the capillary into the muscle tissue, and then take that into the muscle tissue, take the carbohydrate and move it into the mitochondria, and now I get it. So it's an extra 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or so big steps. And we have a physical time delay, right? Imagine I'm doing some sprint work and my hamstrings are dying. I got to bring all that stuff in, transport it through the body, get it all the way down into my hamstrings at a sufficient level. It's just too damn slow. Well, the same sort of thing happens with fat. So we don't have a lot of energy coming from fat from the exercising muscle. We get that from fat stored around the entire body. So now not only do we have to do that, bring in air, move it all, transport thing, but now we have to break down fat that's stored in the back of my neck, put that in the blood, transport that too into the muscle cell, get that into the muscle cell, and get that into mitochondria. There's more detail here, we're going to come back in a second, but that's the big concept. It's just too damn slow. Because it's got too many extra steps, I got to move it around. So if I'm trying to do a bout of exercise or something in performance realm where I need to produce energy really quickly, I'm going to struggle if I'm trying to use fat as my fuel, or even if I'm trying to use carbohydrate from an oxidative perspective. We've seen that both from a theoretical perspective here, as well as performance data in a tremendous amount of studies, right? So that's very scientifically clear. For the most part, you're going to struggle if you have to do that. Opposite. If I'm doing some sort of training where I need to have huge amounts, total amounts of energy, and I'm only using anaerobic glycolysis, well, I'm going to be limited by the total amount of carbohydrate and phosphocreatine I can store. I'll bonk. I'll run out of gas. Right? And so we have to think about what's the actual demand of the sport, the athlete, what time is it, how long is the actual event, how many miles am I covering, or distance, or total work do I need to do? How do I want to pace myself? And then I'm going to use this whole oxidative or anaerobic versus aerobic, fat versus carbs versus phosphocreatine to put me in the optimal situation. That's really best practices for performance physiology. Keep in mind, what I'm showing you here, these are not hard, exact lines. They're predominant energy systems. There's huge carryover, huge crossover. So even, say, 20 seconds of maximal work, you're doing a 20-second all-out air sprint, you're still using some oxidative systems. You're using a little bit of fat. Right? It's not a hard cutoff. It's not 100% ATP PCR and then 100% glycolysis, or the inverse, right? Even if you're 25 minutes into a jog, you still use maybe a little bit of ATP PCR or some anaerobic glycolysis. So those are just kind of predominant systems, but there's no absolutes there. So to recap what we sort of just said, phosphocreatine, PCR, and an MG, muscle glycogen, come from the working muscle itself. What's the problem there? Limited supply, right? Muscle glycogen takes several steps, several-step oxidation process from muscle, or if I'm getting muscle glycogen from another place like the liver, We call that liver glycogen, not muscle glycogen. We'll come back to that later. Fat, even from the muscle itself, has a many-step oxidation platform, and it has to come from the entire body. So what's the problem with that? Well, in the muscle glycogen context, I need O2, which literally takes time, right? Got to get that all transported. And fat has an unlimited supply, but needs oxygen as well and to be transported. And so really what we need to stop doing is thinking about aerobic and anaerobic as being these things that are like fighting and competing, right? They're against each other. And thinking more like these are actually partners. One tremendously supports the other. I like to think of them more of like a gear. When one is turning, it helps the other one turn. So the signals that come from, and we're not going to get into this in a video, but trust me, the signals that come from anaerobic metabolism signal the aerobic metabolism to start going. And so what it basically says is, hey, we're going quick here, we're going hard. We're going to need some aerobic in a little bit. I don't need you now, but get metabolizing fat. Get that thing transported, get these things turned on, get them going so when we get there, you can start managing. And then while you manage that stuff, when we're ready to burst again, come back to me. I'll get it quicker, you go back. And so these are teammates. They're not opponents. They don't hate each other, right? So not only are they not fighting each other, you know, they not only do they get along well, they're actually best buds. They'll probably hop on a bike together and go for a ride, right? No problem there. So let's take a little bit of time now and go into each one of these systems in more detail and start talking about what actually happens. This is what the phosphocreatine or PCR system really looks like. So you take one molecule of phosphocreatine. This is the same thing you get if you supplement with creatine. You use the creatine kinase enzyme, and if you're in my class, you don't need to memorize that, but if you take some sort of certification, you probably should. A lot of them, CS and other stuff, love to ask you if you know these enzymes. Okay, well, creatine kinase will split phosphocreatine up into creatine inorganic phosphate. You'll get some energy from it. That energy you'll then use to go back, take ADP, PI, resynthesize them, and make yourself that ATP molecule. This is classic stoichiometry 1-to-1. 1 phosphocreatine equals 1 ATP PCR. No missing parts there. Well, what causes fatigue of this system? This is one of the cases where it's actually similar to muscle glycogen in that the fatigue of the phosphocreatine system is a product of running out of phosphocreatine. So again, this is why the supplementation works very, very well. If we think about phosphocreatine is going to help power us through that 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 seconds of maximal exercise. Well, that's the type of stuff that phosphocreatine has been shown ad nauseum to help with. So it's very good for strength, power development, things like that. Makes complete sense, right? You bump up that system, you enhance the amount of the substrate there, you can do it more often and you can do it longer. It's going to help you train harder, which is going to have, of course, a carryover effect. And that's, again, been shown clearly in the literature. No question there. In terms of glycolysis, remember glycolysis is lysis, meaning the split, of glycogen or glucose, right? So we're now in a carbohydrate metabolism. Carbohydrate, glucose. Well, if you can see on the picture on the corner there, these big fancy biochemistry charts, and when you get a PhD in human biochemistry like I did, you're going to have to go through and not only memorize these things, be able to draw them out organic chemistry-wise, and it's all kinds of fun. But I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things. You don't need to know this in my class. I don't think anyone really needs to know it, but you do need to know it on certification exams. That the net result of glycolysis is like 2 or 3 or 4 total ATP. Okay, again, don't need to memorize that in my class. Don't care. But what you can see on the corner there, I've got it circled in red. What happens is although you make 4 ATP in this process, it takes you 1 to 2 to invest in the system to actually get them out. So your net is 2 or 3 again. Okay, not a big deal. What I'm more concerned with is this concept. So let's remember, carbohydrates, particularly glucose, are a 6-carbon chain molecule. So the black circles you see on the screen there, each one of those represents a carbon. And so here's really what glycolysis means. You take a glucose molecule that's 6 carbons, split it up into 2 separate 3-carbon molecules, and as a result of that process, you get left with a net couple of ATP. Wabam. It's the exact same damn thing that I just showed you here, where you look at the bottom here, you're still getting those 2 pyruvic acid as the net result. Boom, pyruvate, pyruvic acid, same thing in our context right now, okay? Don't care. But those pyruvates are 3-carbon molecules. So I've taken a 6-carbon molecule, split it in half, because I split and broke a bond right there, boom, that had an exergonic reaction, meaning it gave off net energy. I used that energy to make ATP. but I still have my 3 carbon molecules. This is important. Go check out the physiology of fat loss videos if you want to know what the hell this carbon stuff is all about and why this matters. Right? Physiology of fat, 5 and 55-minute versions. Nonetheless, in terms of performance base, that's glycolysis. We're done. We are out. Okay, glycolysis is anaerobic. You notice it didn't require oxygen, no CO2 to deal with, which is why it didn't require oxygen, so we have no problem with it. Well, the upside of glycolysis is it is, again, tremendously fast. Not as fast as phosphocreatine. You notice I joked earlier, I said, well, it's a one-step system. I said, okay, it's not a one-step system. You can see all of them numbered vertically there. But it's really pretty dang fast. Like literally phosphocreatine is 1 step. This is 11-ish. But it's 11 very fast. So benefit is speed. Downside, of course, in other words, what causes fatigue of the system? Well, we have a couple of things that can be causing fatigue. Number 1, you run out of carbohydrate. If you're out of carbohydrate, you get fatigued here. Number 2 is really the backup system, because what has to happen on the back end to fully metabolize carbohydrate? It has to go from anaerobic to aerobic, that's right. So if I am out of oxygen and I can't move it to there, we've got a problem. And that's when I actually generate my cellular waste. So the upside of anaerobic metabolism, fast. Downside, huge byproducts, waste products that are problematic. Right? So here's what that looks like. If we move over to a separate screen that makes it a little bit easier for me, that big green circle you're seeing on your left-hand side there is the mitochondria. And so glucose oxidation, or again, carbohydrate, glucose, I'm not making a big difference here, starch, glycogen, all kind of saying this carbohydrate. And oxidation meaning aerobic. Well, we went through this process. You take that 3 carbon glucose molecule, split it into 2 separate 3 carbon molecules. Then, as a result, we get those 2 ATP, in red, and you get 2 things called NADH. I don't care that you know that in my class. Important for certifications. I don't care that you know the number. The concept is good enough. What you're going to do with those NAD is send those into the mitochondria. That's going to go to what's called the electron transport chain. And you remember from Phys class, that actually will leave you with the result in a whole bunch of ATP. These are called high energy intermediates. Okay, I don't care that you know the amount. We're not counting ATP in this class. Doesn't matter. Well, if you have sufficient oxygen available, what you will do is take those pyruvate and ship them into the mitochondria. Enter our aerobic part, right? You're following along. I know you know. I know you are. You're smart. And then what we can do with that pyruvate is say, okay, I will take that and convert it into an acetyl-CoA or acetyl-CoA. Now you notice what happened there. I went from a 3 carbon molecule to 2 separate 2 carbon molecules, meaning I've lost 1 carbon each. Where does that carbon go, you say? Well, the answer is right on your screen. And it's actually the only reason why you brought in oxygen to begin with. See, because the quick version is, your body doesn't like free-floating carbon. Think of it like acid. It's a problem. And so it will not allow you to split off a carbon from a molecule like pyruvate. It will not let you rip that carbon off to make it into acetyl-CoA unless it knows you have somewhere to place that carbon. Well, the very easy way to do that is bring in oxygen. Because your body knows oxygen binds very well with carbon to make carbon dioxide. And so if it says, no, you are staying as pyruvate, unless you can bring in a carrier. Oh, you bring in some oxygen? Fine. Go ahead, cleave off that carbon. No issue. Make yourself acetyl-CoA. Because we split a bond again, we got ourselves a little bit more of NADH, or NAD. We can move that to the electron transport chain, make a whole bunch more ATP. Yeah, hey, we're all happy now. And then we can take that leftover carbon, bond it to a little oxygen, make it as carbon dioxide, kick it back out of the mitochondria, put it back in the blood, transfer it back up to our lung, and go, oh. And this is why after doing things like high intensity intervals, we're going, ha, 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 and we're breathe. We're trying to rid ourselves of that carbon dioxide of waste. Right? Now, again, that's pretty synonymous with acid level as well. So the acidity will build up. You'll get a higher acid level, lower pH. What happens if either I'm generating carbon or going through glycolysis too quickly to match my O2 demands, or for whatever other reason, I run out of O2? In other words, what happens if I get excess in the system? I can't do this. mitochondria will not accept it, right? Because eventually what we're going to try to do is take that acetyl-CoA and ship it to what's called the TCA cycle. You probably learned it as a Krebs cycle, okay? And then you go from there, and which we'll get into in a second. But this is going to be our problem area, right? So let's go into Krebs cycle real fast so we can understand what the heck's going on. Again, you got a chart up there. I do not care at all if you memorize that in any of my classes. I want to just highlight and fill in. I want to finish the story for you, really is what I want to get to. So effectively, Krebs cycle is you're taking acetyl-CoA, and the net end product is some ATP, some NADH and FADH2, don't care, you know numbers, some carbon dioxide and water. It is much more efficient than the phosphocreatine system and glycolysis, but it's slower. Ooh, downside. Okay, so actually, we're going to come back later to this, but let me rephrase this. Carbohydrate metabolism, carbohydrate oxidation, is more efficient per molecule of oxygen, in other words, how much oxygen you have to bring in, than even fat metabolism. The fat metabolism thing just gives you so much more ATP, but it's actually less efficient per oxygen molecule. So if you look at this here, we've gone from glycolysis, 6 carbon molecule, and glycolysis, we split that up into 2 separate 3 carbon molecules. Then we shipped it into the mitochondria. When I had oxygen, I took those pyruvates, converted them into acetyl-CoA. Now we're aerobic, right? Anaerobic, ship it in mitochondria, aerobic. Turn those into 2 carbon molecules. Now we're acetyl-CoA. Each one of those acetyl-CoA goes to the Krebs cycle and goes through a whole round of the Krebs cycle. At the end of each round of the Krebs cycle, look on the screen here, you can see bottom over there and other corner. Each round produces 1, 2 carbon dioxides, which tells you I took those 2 carbons each. The other acetyl-CoA will go in the Krebs cycle, 1, 2. So we started off with 6 carbons, went to 2 separate 3s, went into the mitochondria, went to 2 separate 2s, each 2 went to 0, went to 0. Now I have fully metabolized each carbohydrate, glucose or glycogen. I also made some NADH. They'll do just like what we did before. They'll go to the electron transport chain. You'll make ATP out of it. No problem. Right? Along the way, you'll also make a little bit of ATP here, but it doesn't really matter. It's actually kind of pale in comparison to how much you get from the NADH. All right. Boom. So it's NAD, FADH2, etc., the electron transport chain. Cool. Nice little review. If you didn't catch some of that, okay, not a big deal. We're building to something, I promise. I'm not just teaching this for the sake of teaching it. It's going to come back and make sense in a second. So, let's come back to what we were just talking about, right? If I take all that stuff, and we went through this animation already, and we blah, 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 and we shipped in the pyruvate and the mitochondria, made acetyl-CoA, made our NADH, good. But what happened when we had a problem here? What happened when we made that, we went through that process too quickly? Or we ran out of oxygen. You're going to have to go backwards. In other words, electron transport chain stops. It won't work. It won't accept any of these NADHs anymore. That's going to back the whole system up. Things start saying, no, we can't. We're out. I can't do that because I'm out, right? You imagine a shipping logistics. Well, the warehouse is closed. So the trucks are on the parking lot. Well, the parking lot, well, you're not going to load any more trucks, and that's going to be all backed up. And in fact, what happens is the mitochondria won't even accept the pyruvate. They'll say, no, we know we have nothing to do with it because we are an oxygen-needing material, right? We're mitochondria. You don't have any oxygen, we're not taking shit. No way, sorry, right? And so you have to do something else with that mitochondria, which is now entering our waste. So this is where we're going to start first having our conversation about generating too much waste. Now, if you're a fan of these videos, probably one of the most popular ones I've ever done, explain this to you already, and you already know the answer. So you can go, if I skip something, you want to have something too quickly, you can watch one of these other videos. What video is that you ask, Andy? It's the lactate series. Right? This is what lactate is. Lactic acid, I'm not going to differentiate it here, they are different, but that's why you generate lactic acid. Now, lactic acid does not cause fatigue. Let me state that again. It does not make you tired. It actually saves you from being tired. It's just extremely highly associated with fatigue. And this is why. It gets into really high levels or high concentrations when you become extremely fatigued. But you got extremely fatigued because your rate of glycolysis outpaced your rate of being able to bring in oxygen and turn it into aerobic glycolysis, right? Or the slow part. And so you make pyruvate into lactate as a way to stop the whole thing from happening. You then take that lactate and you go watch that 25-minute physiology of video on lactate, right? So I'm not going to get into there, but just trust me. The lactate is helping you a lot, but it also explains why we get it. And so what is that waste really specifically? Let me walk you through it. Free hydrogen ions, H+, are called acid. Right? That's what it is. You've heard of pH, right? It stands for potential hydrogen. Right? So you have a hydrogen, a proton, H+. That means acid. Well, as I explained earlier with the avocado, enzymes don't work well in extremely high amounts of acid. In fact, they stop working. An enzyme is anything that you use to continue a metabolic reaction, or a chemical reaction. So in other words, you can't go through glycolysis. You can't go through anything. You can't go through any of these processes that make energy because the enzymes that make them work don't work in acid. Eek. Okay? So the enzymes are the machinery in either the ATP or phosphocreatine, glycolysis, lipolysis, proteolysis, any of this stuff, trioxylic acid cycle, etc. All that machinery stops in the presence of acid if it gets too high. This is what it looked like, right? Oxidation over there, no acid, right? You see that poor, humble, oh my gosh, like, rest in peace, I hate a wasted avocado. All right? Well, if you don't put acid on that avocado, it starts to metabolize. Well, when that's our own fat, that's a good thing, right? In other words, this chunky, moldy avocado would actually be representative of your body actually producing energy. If you dump acid all over it, though, so if you were to swallow a whole bunch of acid pills or something and not die somehow, you would actually not be able to create energy very well from any aerobic, whether it's fat or carbohydrate, because that acid would stop those enzymes from working. So it's a real problem. So free H+ is acid. Enzymes don't work in acid. The enzymes are the machinery from there. Okay? So what that means is no machinery working, no new ATP. So think back to the beginning of the video. What are the two reasons why we get fatigued? We don't create energy. We have too much waste. And these things are highly overlapping, right? Too much waste stops us from being able to create too much energy. So free hydrogens means no electron transport chain function. No electron transport chain, no free NAD. No free NAD, no new ATP. I can't go through that big energy producing step, that last one. Free hydrogen plus, or free hydrogens, also mean no ATP hydrolysis. That ATP hydrolysis is a fancy way of saying breaking up ATP. So even if I were to give you a bunch of ATP in this situation, you still couldn't break it up because the process of actually splitting the ATP into ADP and PI and making energy, that takes an enzyme, right? ATPase, and that enzyme doesn't work either. So even if you can't produce enough energy, that could be a problem. But even if you had enough energy and you just had too much waste, you can't split the ATP that you have anyways. And so that's really why I separate these two things, because you might be thinking, well, why not just say you run out of energy? Well, that can be the case. But even if you had plenty of energy, and there are plenty of situations, which we'll go over later, which you have like ATP, loads of ATP is not the problem. The problem is you just generate too much damn waste. And so you can't even break up the ATP you currently have because there's too much waste going on, too much acid. All right. So no ATP hydrolysis, no energy. No energy means no muscle contraction, right? All right, maybe in a separate video we'll go over how you actually use energy to make a muscle contract, but you'll have to Google sliding filament theory instead. So really, to summarize that up, right, again, lactate is thought of as this thing that causes fatigue, but really, in some people's mind, George Brooks, his work has shown this pretty clearly, that it's really the message. And so some people call it a hormone, actually, lactohormone, because it's what tells your body to go from anaerobic to aerobic. So it's delivering a message. It's not something you're fighting. So there you were pointing at lactate and causing it, giving it all the blame for your fatigue problems, but it's not really the case. Right? It was really probably the pH, right? Now, we'll have to do a whole separate video on really the mechanisms of fatigue in terms of cellular. It gets more complicated than this, but just think of it as really not lactate per se, but pH. And now you have a better understanding of why. Awesome, huh? Cool. So having said that, we can do things like look at lactate threshold. So this is a very common mark in exercise physiology. And what we would do is we'd say something like, look at the graph at the bottom. So what you're seeing there is increasing in treadmill running speed, right? Just as an example. So if I slowly went faster and faster and faster, you see how blood lactate levels don't really change? But then all of a sudden we hit a point where we just slightly increase speed, but we massively increase lactate. And that's what we call lactate threshold. So it's effectively the point in which your body has a huge nonlinear increase in lactate production. And then what this really signifies is you've now overwhelmed that glycolytic system. So prior to that, we were creating pyruvate through glycolysis. We had enough oxygen because we were going at a slow enough rate where we could get oxygen in, bring it in the blood, get it in the muscle, yada, 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 yada. And we could match the amount of anaerobic glycolysis or aerobic glycolysis we were going with their ability to transfer and place that in electron transport chain because we had sufficient oxygen. Once that got outpaced, you kept generating the energy. In fact, you started creating the energy faster and faster and faster. And so all that pyruvate built up. We started converting a huge amount of that to lactate. We weren't able to bring in sufficient oxygen, and boom, lactate concentration started spilling out from the muscle, getting into the blood. So when I measured your blood lactate, it takes off. All right? So it's a good measure. It's something we can train. It's something that can be changed. The best way to train it is to train at your lactate threshold or slightly below, maybe slightly above, maybe a combination. And we'll push it a little bit more to the right. Because of these reasons, it's often, again, it's not because it's causing fatigue, but it's a good indicator of pace. So in other words, if your lactate threshold, we'll just use the graph from below again, take a look at it. If your lactate threshold kicks in at 10 miles per hour, and mine, or kilometers per hour, and mine kicks in at 11. If you run a race at 10.5, you're going to bonk really fast because you're going to have a huge increase in pH. Right? You have to run it like 9.8. And you can run it at 9.8 for a long time, but if you went to 10.2, you'd really have an acceleration in fatigue. So you got to run it at 9.8, but since my max is at 11, I can run mine at 10.6, easy. And so even if our top end speed is the exact same, our maximum speed we could both run is 20 miles per hour. Since my lactate threshold is higher, I can run at a higher percentage of that maximum speed before I start having a nonlinear or accelerated rate of fatigue. And that's really the way to think about it. And so it is one of our strong predictors of endurance performance is your lactate threshold. It's not the only predictor of it, but it is an important consideration. So let's recap this whole video in one big shot. All right. We've got our carbohydrate molecule, and at the bottom we've got our mitochondria. And imagine all of this happens in the muscle cell. So remember, the carbohydrate you use for energy is in the muscle cell, but not in the mitochondria. It's in the cytoplasm, right? We take our carbohydrate and we split up into pyruvate. I know there should be two pyruvates there, but it's just one. I'm just bigger concepts here, right? That process we call glycolysis. Good? Got it. Great. Fantastic. If I have sufficient oxygen, it comes around. What I'll then do is take that pyruvate, ship it in the mitochondria. From there, I'll take that, convert it into acetyl-CoA, take that acetyl-CoA, make it into the Krebs cycle, runs through the Krebs cycle, some things come out of it, called NADH, etc., and we use that to make a whole bunch of ATP. In terms of fat, that is a separate process called lipolysis. Now, we get most of the fat we use for exercise or for fuel for exercise from outside the exercising muscle. All right, so if I take carbohydrate and I store it, I call it glycogen. I store it in the blood as glucose, actually, to a small amount. But mostly I store it in the muscle as glycogen or in the liver as glycogen. So when I start using the glucose or the glycogen for exercise, it's coming from the glycogen stored in the actual exercising muscle. The fat is mostly coming in the form of triglycerides. So the stored form of fat is a triglyceride. Stored form of glucose is glycogen. So I store fat around my entire body. In order to use that for fuel, I have to go through lipolysis in the actual adipocyte. So I have to break it down in the fat cell that's in my rib or my foot or whatever if I want to send that energy from fat into my hamstring. Okay? Now, as you saw from the animation there, your fat is stored in a triglyceride. We call that a triglyceride 1, 2, 3 triglyceride. See those red circles? All these circles are carbon. But that red circle of 3 there is called glycerol. So a triglyceride is made of a 3-carbon backbone known as glycerol. And then it has 3 separate fatty acid chains. They're all big long chains of carbon. They could be 8 carbons long, 10 carbons, 12, 24 carbons, etc. Different video, right? But they all have different names, palmitic acid, stearic acid, etc. Right? They could be unsaturated, saturated fats. You don't know that. Point is, you got to take that highly packed E-shaped molecule triglyceride, break it up into its own individual components, the glycerol backbone and 3 separate fatty acids. But remember, that requires oxygen to begin with. If I do that, I can ship that glycerol into the mitochondria. And then because it's a 3-carbon molecule, it'll actually function pretty much like a pyruvate. I'm talking big concepts here. You could turn that into acetyl-CoA, goes into trioxylic acid cycle, goes electron transport chain, same exact thing. You can then ship the fatty acids into the mitochondria, and I skipped a step there. We'll come back to it, don't worry. But you can ship those big long carbon chains into the mitochondria. You can break them up 2 carbons at a time. Since it's a 2-carbon molecule, it'll function and process basically like an acetyl-CoA molecule. It'll go through Krebs cycle, etc., etc., etc. So once you learn that basic process of how mitochondria makes energy from carbon, it doesn't matter if you're getting a 2-carbon molecule from glucose or getting a 2-carbon molecule from fat. It's going to function very similar from there, at least the mechanics of it. Okay, upside of carbohydrate, stored right there in the cell. Downside, going to run out quick. Upside of fat, stored unlimited amounts, basically. Downside, got to be transported, go through a whole bunch of steps. All right, going to take a lot longer. Protein is made of amino acids. Now you can take an amino acid and split it up, kind of metabolize it and get a couple of carbons out of it. Remember, that's that's aerobically needed though. Ship those 2 carbons in the mitochondria. It functions just like acetyl-CoA. You can move on from there. You can also go through a process where you take a bunch of these, combine them together, and make a pyruvate. Take those pyruvates, send it to the liver, pack those together, and actually make a new carbon molecule called gluconeogenesis. So you're making new glucose, a new glycogen from a non-carbohydrate source. Okay, you can do that, but it's not the best thing. Again, metabolically, you're going to lose a lot of ATP to make a little bit. It's not a good exchange in terms of energy production. Remember, everything happened in that mitochondria is oxidation. Everything outside of that is not, right? In the cytoplasm. Phosphocreatine I did put on this list, but it would be right up there, kind of right next to the carbohydrate, right? No component of aerobic exercise that. Not going to go to the mitochondria. Going to ship over, immediately get it. Point being, the final end product of all metabolism, whether it's fat, and you can see the picture of the bacon down there, it's got fat and protein, or the sugar cubes or carbohydrate. And again, when I say carbohydrate, I don't mean like sugar or bread only. Carbohydrate from anything. All the good carbs too, right? Regardless of what you do though, the end product is 3 things and 3 things total. ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. You use water for the things you used it for, you make ATP, and you take that carbon dioxide, it's waste, and you blow it out. So, carbohydrate oxidation. Let's talk about fatigue. What causes fatigue of that system? Well, either running out of muscle glycogen or not having enough oxygen available to be able to go into oxidation. The waste products then, H+, remember you generate that acid, carbon dioxide, and lactate, that La negative. Remember though, lactate's not necessarily bad for you. It's the H+ and the carbon dioxide that are the problems. In terms of fat oxidation, what causes fatigue of that system? Well, none really. That's right. It's not a fatigue issue. What's the issue, a downside of fat again? It's just too slow, right? But it's not going to run out. It's not going to fatigue. It doesn't really matter, right? It does generate waste, though, a lot of carbon dioxide. Right? So we have to handle that as well. So that being said, I have put this all together in a 5-minute video already that is up. That you can check out. I think it's actually more like 7 or 8 minutes long. But I'm not going to go over it again here because it would just be superfluous. What you need to understand, though, before you go forward with this video or in the physiology of endurance video, is how you can go from carbohydrates that you eat, so you eat an actual piece of carbohydrate, whatever that happens to be, how that goes in your stomach, how that gets into blood, what you do with that in liver, how you store that in muscle. Maybe some of that gets stored as fat, not a whole lot, but some of it. What happens to fat, how you break it down, how it's stored, how you put it back in, where you store that, etc. Right? So I'm clicking through this really quickly, and I'm not explaining it. You got to go back and watch that video. I've already done it. Right? I'm trying to save you time. All of you that already watched it, this would be a waste of time. So you can go back and do that. What we do need to acknowledge is this. If you eat a higher fat diet, you can bias this metabolism a bit. So if you eat more fat, you'll burn more fat. That's totally true. But you also store more fat. Right? If you eat more carbohydrate, you'll also burn more carbohydrate and you'll store more. So here's the net result. If you're doing a type of exercise that you know is going to be carbohydrate dependent, think intervals, right? Think anaerobic stuff. Well, then eat carbohydrate beforehand. It shifts you, or number one there, it biases you towards carbohydrate metabolism. It lets you take advantage of it. That's a fantastic thing. Okay, if you're doing something though that's the opposite, that is really long duration endurance based, it's going to be heavily relying on fat as a fuel, well then maybe you eat some fat beforehand, you bias oxidation towards fat, and that'll help you there. Now the opposite could be a problem, right? So eating a whole bunch of carbohydrate prior to a fat burning event may be a problem. We'll talk about this in another video. And likewise, biasing towards fat oxidation when you're trying to do exercise that is carbohydrate dependent might slow you down and might hurt your performance. So you got to be really careful there. There's also a tremendous amount of individual variation here. So you really got to try these things out before making either blanket statements or blanket recommendations. So our net result, number one, the food you eat or consume immediately prior to your exercise or two can bias this equation a little bit, right? It can also bias storage. So we got to take that in consideration. But it doesn't change the net total. Right? So here's what I mean. If you eat fat before a workout, that doesn't mean you burn more calories. It just means you shifted more of the burn towards fat, but you also shifted an increase the storage towards fat. Same thing with carbohydrate, right? So it's not going to change your total if calories are equated. So what I really mean by this is typically what we recommend is you keep protein levels fairly consistent, but you might alter the percentage of energy, assuming the total energy intake is the same. The percentage of which you get from fat versus carbohydrate, you might alter depending on individual physiology or the type of workout you're doing. So if I have an athlete who's already tremendously good at burning carbohydrates as a fat, as a fuel, and we're going to do a long duration workout, I might have them eat a little more fat. They'll have a little bit less carbohydrate, so I'll keep total calories the same. A greater percentage of the food comes from fat, and so we can start learning to metabolize fat better. Or I'll do the opposite. If I have the opposite scenario, right? So an athlete who's really good at fat, but just has a hard time getting going, can't bring the intensity early, maybe we'll give them a bunch of carbohydrate or a little bit of carbohydrate before, see if we can bias them towards carbohydrate metabolism, and see if we can get some energy production a little bit faster. All right? So that being said, you got to go through this part of the video, and you also need to go through this one where I talk about how we use these things individually. This is a bit of a recap of some of the things I just talked about, but I go into more detail in this video, so you really got to go through this thing to understand the pros and cons of each one of these systems, right? So to wind down, this is really what we're going to get to. In the physiology of endurance, I'm going to basically start on this slide. So what I want to show you is how, in fact, we do go through each one of these different systems, lay out the physiology. So for example, I'll start with the nerve, and we'll talk about, okay, well, what kind of metabolism does the nerve go through? Does the nerve use fat? Does it use carbohydrate? Where are the places of failure in the nervous system? Same thing with the muscle, right? We'll go through different types of muscle, and we've kind of done that in this video. We'll go through blood, lung, adipose, liver, etc., etc. So in that physiology of endurance video, we'll take what we just learned here about the basic mechanics of energetics, and we'll start learning how or why we get failure in different areas of the system. Once we do that, we can then jump to the fun, and we're going to do that in another video. And here's what I'll do is I'll lay out 4 different types of performance. So maximum power, like a 1-rep max or a max vertical jump. Muscular endurance, high intensity intervals, and long duration endurance. And what we'll do is we'll go through each one of those physiological systems, 1 through 6. And we'll talk about in each of these different performance examples, where's the point of failure, fatigue, and what we can do about it. So that's in the physiology of endurance video, so go check that out. As always, I appreciate your support. I know this is a heck of a video. Actually, I was going to do this as well as the physiology of endurance video in the same one until I realized, oh my God, it's going to be like a 4.5-hour video. So thanks for sticking around. As always, you can tell I put countless hours into all of these videos. This is my life's work. This is what I do for a living. This is how I feed my child and everything else. So I'm giving this away for free. Always will. I appreciate your support. It makes a big difference, and it means a lot to me. So because I'm giving this all out, I have a small ask of you. Of course, like, subscribe, share these videos, etc. More importantly, the way that I make this stuff work is through a Patreon account. So I take donations there. If you just got an hour and a half of free high-level exercise physiology education, nutrition education, and you can afford $5, $10, $20, I would really appreciate it. I take that money, that allows me to do things like check out how high quality this video is, the HD stuff, the production. I can send this to a production team, they put it together, I post it up, right? So instead of taking this video, probably took me, just to film alone 10 hours. To create the content, to put this together, you're not going to find this in a textbook. Right? This is stuff I've created originally from my own head. No one's ever put this together or told me to do this way. So how long do these videos take me? Well, my whole career is how long they take. Right? So if you can afford it, if you can help support, I really, really appreciate you going to that Patreon. It's just patreon.com/Andy Galpin. Contributing whatever you can to the prizes. That allows me to, again, literally pay my production team. I also take that money and I can support my students to do things for me that buy me time to make more of these damn videos. Right? I have a full-time job, I have athletes to take care of, I have a family, my own health, etc. So if you want more of these videos, you want to keep sustaining me making more of this stuff, the comments are great below, the messages you send me are fantastic, that's all great, but really, put your money where your mouth is. That's how you show support. I get messages constantly, how can I support, what can I do? Well, that's the answer, right? Contribute. Put in $10, put in $5. I've had a couple of people donate $100, things like that. That's all fantastic. If I were to charge you for these, I'd be getting a much higher price point for that. I don't want to do that. If you can't afford it, fine, no problem at all. Like, subscribe, share around, and I'll call that good. I'll never come hunting you down for that. But for those of you that can, I'm basically giving you free college education here. Hopefully you can part with a few bucks for that. That being said, end with my sales pitch. I hate that shit. I hope you learned something, had some fun, and we'll see you back in the next installation of the physiology of endurance or whatever hell other video you want to jump to next. Thank you.